roughly 5 years to the day, pretty much as of May the 9th, we decided to have a go at launching an office media network in London. We had and still have a sister company in Australia called Executive Channel. And for those of you that know us a little bit more, that's how we launched in the UK. So to add to the complications of trying to break into the property market and launch a new media in a new environment, we decided to rebrand ourselves about 2 or 3 years ago to ECNLive, predominantly because the words executive and channel, we didn't really like either of them, so it didn't really sit too well as a company name. I think that just picking up on particularly what Tim was talking about this morning and our story going forward, that one of the key things for looking at what we were going to do and the reason for doing it was because we could actually, if we were to get it right, which I believe we have, deliver something that was completely new and reach an audience that wasn't currently being reached in a different environment in outdoor, and therefore get away from the issue of cannibalization and talk about actually creating something that's a little bit more interesting and unique for not just the outdoor media industry, I think that's quite important, but also just generally something that would add coverage to a general media campaign. So I'll take you through a little bit about, without selling, I'll try not to sell. If I do, then hold up a yellow card, but there are obviously a few slides in there that show some nice ads that we've been running and tell you a little bit about the background and the challenges and why we did it and what we're going to do going forward. So essentially, we put screens in the lift lobby areas of major office buildings. The reason for that is because the audience is pretty key in terms of the one that we deliver. They're hard to reach in a traditional media channel. And there's high dwell times in city buildings and across the West End, and it's a good time to communicate with people. But it's not just about advertising for us. I mean, the key part of it was communicating with tenants, so it's a mix of content as well, and making sure that the content was live and relevant to the people in the buildings. And the biggest challenge there was to talk to the property community about why we should put screens into their buildings and what they were currently doing. Very little in terms of building communication was wrong, how we could upgrade that, digitize it, and give them something back. So essentially, had we gone in and talking about a pure play advertising model and said, we're just going to hit your high value audiences with people paying huge amounts of rent with advertising, they would have said no. They're extremely skeptical about the advertising platform anyway. They gave us some good tips along the way, like you're going to put spearmint rhino in our building, obviously recognizing the audience that they had that was there. And still to this day, they're very, very aware of what runs in the buildings and making sure that we can get the right brands to come in and do that. So also the hugely important part to them was about how they could get rid of existing communication, which a lot of the time they were sticking up posters and pop-up stands and all sorts of things, and use the screens to their advantage. So the third part of what we do, there's branded content, advertising, there's live news information that comes through white labeled for us, and then there's building communication as well. So it's a case of them able to, whether it's about fire alarms, whether it's about integrating their own Twitter feeds or social media feeds through companies, or whatever it might be, they can tailor-make their messages for each office building. In terms of the market and who was doing what, we're the only company that's currently doing this in Europe. Focus Media in China are about the oldest. As you can see by some of this technology, it's not the greatest. In fact, I think Focus Media has about 2,000 office buildings that do this, and it involves someone literally walking around sticking in a dongle and updating on a daily or weekly basis. So the back end was probably not quite up to scratch. Sister company in Australia, Captivate and Wall Street Journal Network. You've probably obviously heard of Wall Street Journal, but as you can see, we thought that there was something that we could improve on with the technology side of things. So where we are at the moment, we're up to about 150 buildings. We've got about 2,000 businesses that work across all of the offices that we're in. A lot of SMEs, which make up that number as well, and some large corporates. We've got built towards 100 advertisers. It's a good revenue story, and it's a good audience. So essentially, we sell on the back of the audience that we deliver. It's a good one in terms of the hardest to reach as a media proposition anyway. And for us, it's important not to put ourselves in that little pond of outdoor advertising, and to take it to actually grow the market, to talk to brands that are not traditional users of outdoor, which we've done pretty well. So in terms of the launch, some statements of the bleating obvious, really. We had to talk to the property market about letting us into the buildings. That was interesting. So it took about, if I'm being honest, probably nearly a year to get into our first building. And it was at a time where the property industry was on its knees, along with the media industry. The people that we did build up a kind of rapport with were systematically made redundant about 2 months down the line. So we really struggled to get those relationships going, and it took a long, long time to do that. So eventually, obviously, we did it. It took longer than we thought, and obviously we needed the backing in order to continue to plug in that trail as we did. Secondly, to get the product right, and that's something that we didn't do from the start, and was a kind of key learning point. I think part of that was to do with the fact that we were rushing, and secondly, the technology just wasn't there. And one of the key things for the landlords was to make sure that if we were going to go into the Gherkin and Tower 42 and the Broadgate estate, that aesthetically the screens looked matched with the buildings and didn't stick out from walls and all sorts of things. So that was something that took time to do, probably about the first 2-3 years. And thirdly, and this was the kind of second phase of the launch, because for the first 2 or 3 years we were developing the product, talking to the landlord community, and certainly not talking to the media community, because we didn't want people knowing about what we were doing in case somebody came in and did it themselves. So in terms of our little story over the last 5 years, I won't dwell on it, but we started with just 2 of us in a little Regis office, got a bit claustrophobic. Then obviously bringing on a partner from the VC side of things to bankroll the business. We had some private funding that came through from our sister company in Australia as well. We signed our first property contracts in 2010, which is obviously key. We got up to about 80 buildings around the start of 2011. That's when we started taking it out to the media market. We thought that was a good time to do that and try and get our first advertisers on board. And then 2012 was, across 2011, 2012, that was key in terms of getting the buildings and the property contracts, the big ones that we wanted in order to roll out the estate. And it's a pretty disparate market. It's a very fragmented market, the property one. One of the mistakes that we made from the start was thinking that we could try and talk to landlords, and then realising that there were just so many of them, from Canadian teachers' funds to various Qataris, that it really wasn't going to happen. So, you know, like with the media industry and the advertising industry, it's pretty much controlled by the big agents, and we kind of needed to embrace them. And then we found ourselves kind of picking off batches of 20, 30 buildings, and it enabled us to roll out pretty quickly. And where we are at the moment is we're getting towards 200 buildings by the end of this year, and we're now in a position where we kind of choose which ones we want to do. The model is based on, without going into too much detail, but we pay for all the installations and everything that goes in from the front end, so it's not really in our interest to make sure that we stick in the wrong kind of buildings that aren't going to meet with the advertisers' demands. I think this is a kind of key thing, and following on a little bit from what was said this morning, that I think there's too much of an idea in outdoor with networks that if you just stick in a load of digital, then people go whoopee-doo and we're going to buy it. And I think clearly what has been seen over the last few years is that, and the cannibalisation of certain media, but tends to be in a lot of the same environments. And I think that people need to take a a step back and think about the bigger media picture and what they're actually adding when thrown into, whether that's social media, television, press, any kind of traditional media strategies and plans that you might be looking at. And one of the things that we knew was that we had the accountability and we had the audience that was already there, and the fact that we could, with building passes, we could account for everyone that was coming in and therefore deliver on what people wanted in that environment. So what we had was, and this is talking about what was currently in the office buildings, was the ability to talk to landlords about getting rid of the kind of rubbish that was currently sitting in their office buildings. They were sticking up posters in lifts and all sorts of funny things. Often the communication was in the wrong areas, so visitor areas, so nothing to do with tenant communication, just to do with people that were coming in. If you go into office buildings now, you often see televisions that are in reception areas, but they're really for visitors' entertainment. They don't communicate with people coming in that actually work in the building at all. The third point about relevant communications, one of the things that we, when it was being viewed quite sceptically by the property industry, that we were able to make a clear point about, was the fact that you already had TVs running in your office buildings, and often they were running commercial channels that were showing daytime television in corporate environments and therefore relevant advertising. So when they were objecting to the fact that we might be advertising to the tenants, we were making the point to say, well, actually the advertising is relevant, it's not intrusive, and it gets away from what you're currently showing. And of course, as you can see with pop-up banners, you're pushing an open door when you're talking about the flexibility of digital. One of the things that I'll come on to, that we've given the building owners and the agents, is the fact that they can control what they actually put on in terms of their communication. So that's another enabler for digital that they're able to do. And these things are expensive to reprint. You can only run one thing at a time unless you put a scrolling 6-sheet in your office building, which is not really likely. So this is an ad for pregnancy stretch cream. And this is the Clifford Chance building down in Canary Wharf, one of the biggest law firms in Europe. And we were standing around and they were talking about the fact that, do we really want advertising in our own building? We've got these screens and it's a bank of TVs across the wall showing about 3 or 4 different channels. There was no consistency in it. There was nothing about Clifford Chance whatsoever that was relevant to anyone coming in, whether they're the visitors or the staff of their own building. And up popped cocoa butter formula, and it's clearly not right for their environment. And at that point, I think that they realised that what we were talking about certainly had a bit more relevance than that. So that's currently examples of what you'll see around a lot of office buildings. Again, the ability to get rid of some of that and digitise it and be more flexible is something that has been very welcomed. We've got about 15 screens across Channel 4 and Horseferry Road. We don't run advertising on them, they pay for them. And they use them purely for internal comms. And I think that's quite interesting because obviously they're a big TV broadcaster, not as big as they used to be. But they wanted to clearly distinguish between what was a television product, and they got enough TVs across Horseferry Road, and what was something that would be seen as internal staff communication. So obviously by moving away from the landscape format of TV and moving into portrait enables them to distinguish, the staff to distinguish between that. And that's because they had an issue with the intranet. I don't know how many companies still use it, but basically it being there and nobody even logging on. A lot of big companies have that. They realise that only about 5% of people are actually taking any notice of the intranet in their company. So it's great for us to kind of get that contract. We've got a few others that we work with on a non-ad site basis. I think for big companies, it's a bit of a no-brainer that they get rid of this sort of communication and move to digitise it, whether it's with us or with anybody else. In terms of where we were at that point, so we were ticking the boxes, meeting exact demands of the property industry that were there. They wanted products that aesthetically looked good, that enabled them to have control over them. We had to benefit those working our property and the partner buildings, and then make sure that the locations were right for the screens. So in terms of what we got wrong, that's what we got wrong. That was our first installation. It pains me to look at it now, to be perfectly honest, but it's something that we luckily did in a building that was very local to us. But I think that the point of this, what it explains, is that 4 years ago when we did this was a technology that was available, and we couldn't find anything that was a commercial screen that was thin enough to stick on an office wall. It's as simple as that. You know, that was coming out about 120 mil from the wall. We're now down to about 40. So all these kind of aesthetic issues were the nuts and bolts of why we couldn't kind of move the business on as quickly as we wanted to in the first year or two. And you can see where we're at now, and how things have moved on. We're now even able to integrate screens into walls. We're now talking to architects about buildings prior to them actually being completed, like the cheese grater and walkie-talkie, and about how the screens can actually not be retrofitted but be part of the actual makeup of the building. So when we were looking at launching the business back in 2009, doesn't need me to tell you, but the outdoor industry was recovering from the crash of 2008, so it's an interesting time to do it. I think that what it did, because the property market was more on its knees, was enabled us to talk to people at a time where they actually wanted something new to talk about with their tenants. I think that the media and advertising industry, not too much was launching around that time, so it gave us the opportunity to kind of seize the moment of a pretty depressed time and look for growth going forward. So for landlords, we provided a new comms platform. That's something that they were very keen on doing within the office building. Our contracts provided a new revenue stream, obviously at a time when commercial lets were down and new buildings weren't opening. And we injected a bit of life into the office environment, which is always appreciated by the tenants. I touched on it earlier, but dealing with the property industry had its challenges. We were from a media background. The property industry, certainly different types. They hadn't seen people like us before that were coming in and looking to commercialise anything or sell advertising in the building. So although for sort of comic effect we've drawn on a few extremes there, but it probably wasn't too far away from the truth. You know, taking media into the property industry was a little bit like never the twain shall meet. What we had to do was form the long-term partnerships. We got the aesthetics right for the screens. We could prove the value to the tenants and to the advertisers, and then we had to look at the reliability and control that it would give them over the screen. So that's a busy old chart, but it shows the back-end capability of the system from the software point of view, which is quite key as far as they're concerned. Building messages, staff notifications, live news that comes in directly from a white labelled source, updates every 5 minutes, and then the ability to integrate social media as well. And that last part, no great surprise, is really the one that's replacing a lot of the live news. It's about companies wanting to integrate Twitter feeds and other social media. So the back-end investment was obviously key for the business. This enables us to run all of our software from the office, and also for the building managers and the agents to put in what they want to put in that's relevant to each building. Some of the time it's not very good, so we need to make sure that that's in keeping with the actual quality of the ads that are on there. They only take a small slot of it, and we tend to ensure that it's all flashed and in keeping with the quality of what we got. These are just some of the office buildings that we're in. So we communicate with quite a few big companies and big property owner groups. We think we were about the first media to launch in new environment for quite a few years. I think certainly in outdoor, I think people have replicated environments or done different things or different takes on different things, but I think we were probably the first company to launch something into a new environment for quite a while. At the time of launching, there were challenges. The market was still at a place where it wasn't growing and only really started growing in outdoor terms from last year. We were selling essentially, which was a city estate, Canary Wharf estate. We've spread out now across London to West End media companies who didn't get across there very often. So that was a case of convincing people that there was a world in the city outside of the West End. And at the time of launch, we had sort of 40 to 50 buildings, and then convincing people that obviously that would grow and bringing on the right partners from that stage. The first brands we got on, courtesy of our friends at Mindshare. So Amex, Jaguar and IBM, three pretty good brands to kick off with. And IBM are still our biggest client, and they're often great exponents of doing live feed data around Wimbledon and other events, and the Rugby World Cup they're sponsor of, and bringing in content as well for the England rugby team as well. So the key thing for us, and I think that for a lot of media owners that are out there at the moment, is that we continue to invest in the media and grow the proposition, whether that's in London, in France, where we're investing in the moment, we're up to about 40, 50 buildings, and then to try and think where that can take us. And one of the key issues, I guess, for us as a business is to understand how much of that money can actually be grown out of the existing outdoor or out-of-home pot. And interesting, picking up from what Tim was saying earlier, that when people are talking about the growth of digital out-of-home, when compared to the growth of outdoor generally, digital out-of-home is it's a format within that. Outdoor is not growing fast enough in order to keep a lot of media owners happy. So I totally agree with what Tim was saying earlier, that when positioned outside of that, if you like, and talking about a different screen proposition and taking money from different areas, encouraging new clients to use things, and that's really where the growth comes from. And just a couple of different types of ads. I think that this is where we've moved on to in terms of more consumer approach with the ads. Red Bull ran last month. I don't think that's a brand that we would have taken a couple of years ago. So we're quite excited about the future, and thank you very much.